Well, it has quite a few similarities, the outstanding one being that the subject matter has some relation to the surface or the support that the imagery is on. This is common in my work going back to the 60s, where early paintings of mine were in fact paintings of the construction of the very canvas, the weave, the warp and the weft of the cotton canvas I was painting on. Some sort of an integral relationship between subject, process, and support. The other similarity to many of the surface, other series of paintings are that there's a grid used in the organization of the painting, and also they're modular. The components that add up to the image in some cases have been fabricated brush strokes made out of cotton balls, or in this case a gridded surface on sheetrock, or wallboard as it's commonly known, which results in a pixelated system to develop the imagery. The subject is essentially a kind of detail, a fresco of crumbling columns, as one might see in a public building or a religious building of classical design. The wallboard of course, enables me to create, in essence, a fresco. By removing the paper and glue from the wallboard, we get a plaster-like surface, whether it's a facsimile of plaster, as in the case of the long paintings, or gypsum in the case of the square paintings. Both are easy to paint on in terms of the absorption of watercolor paint to create whatever shape is in the paintings. Therefore, it gives the impression, theoretically, that this is a detail. This is a section of wall that has been removed from the wall, or if they were installed by embedding them in the wall, it would give the impression that in fact it would look like the surface of the wall had been scored and been painted directly on the wall. Because of very realistic concerns in terms of conservation and handling, I've chosen to have these paintings remain isolated and then framed with a protective metal frame, because the edges of the sheetrock and plywood of which these are constructed are very fragile, not once they're hanging, but if you were to move them around a bit, they could be damaged. Other paintings like this that have a kind of political sub-subject to them, and that are same or similar in the way they're constructed. There was a period, a group of works from 1975 that were about the history of cotton. It's sort of the idea of, rather than making some paintings that were derivative of ideas about the history of painting, I made paintings that were about the history of the material that the paintings were constructed from. And in other words, in a kind of perverse way, these images of plantations and slaves and field workers, antebellum plantations and Spanish moss and paddle wheelers, in essence described the cost of art materials in a perverse way, that what price you pay for culture, or an often perceived elitist activity, the production of art for sale. Same is true with the new paintings, in that these are definitely a kind of classical situation that's deteriorating, moving back and forth in space, crumbling, so to speak. It has to do with the dissolution of empire to some extent. You let the viewers decide which empire we're talking about, whether it's the Roman Empire or one that is more current. And this is an example of two groups of paintings that are a good 30 plus years apart that have a completely different style to them, yet have a kind of physical overall composition that's pretty demanding, and have a subtext of, if not direct political language, have a kind of dark humor toward them, kind of a sense of irony, I would guess. There's other works of mine that also have a similar kind of idea. For instance, some paintings from the 80s of sailing ships, where the paintings were in essence rigged. They had a wooden frame, a stretcher bar, but only the support was a network or armature of clothesline, in which paint was then applied to until those apertures closed up to form a completely closed-in surface, which held the images of 17th or 18th century sailing ships. The arithmetic involved with the drawing and placement of the armature created a specific convex and concave surface on the canvases, which is very similar to the kind of manipulation of process and image and materials that you see in these new works. These paintings, I guess, are neoclassic to some extent. They hint back at somebody from the art historical past, particularly the French 19th century painter Puvis de Chavannes, who was a neoclassicist who did make some fresco paintings, was interested in depicting the grand scene, and ironically, as kind of saccharine as his work can be at times, seemed to have had an influence on the great modern master Cézanne. So I always, in my work, I try to find that kind of perfect mesh between a material that I can compose with, that has contemporary relevance, and some sort of way in which I can have a painting which is a very physical, bordering on an object, as a conclusion to, like, the effort I put into it. It's funny, I'm already working on two new sets of things that will fall very close in theory to these paintings, and one's going back again to the 60s, but will look absolutely nothing like these. The reason I'm pretty pleased right now is that by having two directions to go, I'll be able to continue my attempt to avoid being involved with the notion of a particular style that's attached to me. Style is chronological. It also has to do with the passage of time. I'm very much against the notion of quintessential style. I'm afraid that very often it separates an artist's life work into early work and late. very often your late work is prejudiced against, and I'm trying to have like rather a kind of a happy beginning and a happy ending. And since the work is composed, the ideas come from a conceptual base, or essentially a literary kind of format, I'm often more worried about an addition to the body of work that has a kind of contemporary relevance. I'm more worried about that than a development of style or the works particularly being better from one set to the other. So I'm pretty pleased with this group. I hold the paintings about the South, which I did in 1975. I hold them in pretty high regard among my life's work, and I think that this work, some 40 plus years approximately later, I hold up with those pretty good, so I feel very confident about these paintings.